Hello, I'm Adam, and today we're talking about Android navigation and Android activity lifecycle methods. Let's get started. Alright, so before we jump into the lifecycle methods, I want to talk a little bit about how the navigation stack works in Android. And to do that, I'm going to use the whiteboard. So here I've got a single activity. So let's pretend the app has just launched. We have activity 1, maybe that's our login screen, maybe it's our splash screen, is now visible to us as a user. We click a button on that screen, and what ends up happening is we end up popping another activity on top. So you can think of that as like the traditional stack that you would see in data structures, where the last item that gets pushed in is going to be on top of the stack, which is going to be the first item to be removed. And let's say we do that a few times. So we maybe we push a total of 3. Maybe this is activity 3 sitting there on top. And then all of a sudden we change our mind as a user and we hit the back button on Android, or maybe there's a button that's been programmed in that will take us back to the previous screen. And what ends up happening in that is we end up popping this off. And now this activity would be destroyed or removed from memory because it's no longer needed. And this activity, which had been previously in the background, now comes back to the front. And activity stacks can actually get very, very deep. And what will end up happening is the Android operating system will remove some of the ones that are further down in the stack if memory gets low. So to create a new activity, we're going to use the new intent, and we're going to call start activity on the activity that you're currently in's object. So we would do that to create a new activity. We create a new intent that we want to show activity to. That gets pushed on the stack by the start activity call. And then if we want to go back, say we want to close activity 2 and go back to the first activity, it's as simple as calling finish on the current activity's instance. And you'll see some examples up on the screen as we go through these. There are a total of 7 lifecycle methods on an Android activity. Some of these you will find incredibly useful. Others you may only need in very niche circumstances, but I think it's important for you to be aware of all 7 of these. We're going to start by talking about onCreate. OnCreate, the easiest way for me to explain that is it's sort of like the constructor for the activity. It is only called one time per active instance of that activity. Now you can have an activity have multiple instances on the stack, and onCreate will get called for each one of those. So you can think of onCreate as the place where you want to set up that activity, knowing that that will not get called again if that activity gets brought back to the foreground after being backgrounded. OnDestroy you can think of as the reverse of that, as the destructor. This is going to be called right before that activity is removed from memory. And it's important because you may have things that you need to release. You might have memory allocated that you need to make sure the Java memory manager knows to free up. Or maybe there's something that you actually need to do that's outside of the scope of memory, but you just need to do something when that activity closes. It's important to keep both of those as lightweight as possible. And actually, I'm going to say that's true for all 7 of these. But in particular, you want to make sure that as screens are navigating back and forth between each other, if you have a lot of processing that's happening between one or another of these, you will get a slow time for that next screen to launch. The next 2 we're going to talk about is OnResume and OnRestart. OnResume is going to be called anytime the screen becomes interactable by the user. So think about that as now the user can actually click buttons and see that screen. Now that may be called in the process of that activity being created, or it might actually be called from an activity that has been backgrounded and brought back to the foreground. OnRestart, on the other hand, is called if an activity has been stopped and is now being reused, restarted again for the user to use. Restart typically is followed by the onStart command, or the onStart method rather. All right, the next two that we're going to talk about is going to be onStop and onStart. And honestly, onStop is one that I very rarely use, but you may actually never see this called, because what ends up happening a lot of times is a low memory device will stop an activity to save memory, and then that activity may be reused again, which will go through the on restart. In the example that we're going to talk about a little bit later, I'd be willing to bet that you will never see on stop and on restart unless you end up putting a ton of activities on the stack in your use of that application. On start, on the other hand, is one that is called right after on create, or anytime that activity is also being given to the user for interaction. All right, last but not least is on pause. And this is a very tricky one in my opinion. So I like to think of on pause as something has came in front of your application and stopped it from like being able to be interacted by the user. And my gaming background has me think about a pause screen that comes up. So a menu that comes up when you hit like the start button that pauses the game, right? Like you're no longer taking updates from the user. That's the way I like to look at it, and it's the simplest way. And you can probably get this to happen, depending on your type of phone, by bringing up like something that overlays the screen and captures input, maybe like a phone dialer, or like the notifications bar sometimes might do that. Just play around with different things and you'll see how that is called or isn't called. It's really an interesting one. And anyway, on pause is useful in some cases, especially when you're trying to respond to things and you know that the user can't give you input. But I do want to circle back and tell you the ones that you will most likely be using initially in your journey in Android development. And I will say that it's good to be familiar with all of these, because there may be niche times that you need to come up with solutions that require you to respond to one of these lifecycle methods. But the first two that I have up here, on create and on destroy, in my opinion, are going to be the most used, followed by the on resume and the on pause. And this is just my personal experience. On resume and on pause allow you to know that, say for example, you've set up an activity, but the user has navigated beyond that screen, so stuff may have changed that relates to the context of the screen you're currently in. So when you come back to that screen, on resume gets fired, you may need to check something or do some extra processing to reset back up that activity to be accurate after any changes that the user has done down the chain of activities that they have launched. So honestly, the best way to learn is to do this yourself. And what I have done is I've set up a GitHub repository. I'll have the link below in the description, and I'll also have it below me, that has a project that you should clone. At the time, I have that set up with Android 3.1.4. I have 3 activities in that project: main activity 2, and main activity 3. Very clever naming for those of you that were paying attention. You will see that I have a very simple layout on each of those 3 screens with a on previous and on next button. If you look at main activity.java, you will see that I've already done some setup with you to hook the on next and the on previous functions to the appropriate code. What you want to have happen is you want main activity, when on next is hit, to launch main activity 2. In main activity 2, when you hit on next, you want it to launch main activity 3. When main activity 3 on next is clicked, you want it to launch main activity, and just keep going through that chain. If you will notice that in main activity.java on the previous button, I very simply have a finish call. That finish call says I am done in my current activity. I'm going to remove it from the stack, so let's go to the previous one. You will need to do a couple things here. The first thing that you will need to do is you will need to update the logic to, in each of those 3 activity classes, to respond to those 7 lifecycle events. Keeping in mind that you may never see a couple of them, but it will allow you to, in real time, be able to see logs come out for the order that these are actually fired. The second thing that you will need to do is you will need to update each of the layout files to point to the callback methods that you will create in main activity 2 and main activity 3 to respond to onPrevious and onNext. Please use the main activity.java file as an example for that, as well as the main activity layout file to see how those onClick handlers are set. Finally, what you will need to do is add a printout, a system.out.print line to each one of these 7 lifecycle methods. These 7 lifecycle methods should be main activity, colon, and then the event. For example, if you're in a main activity 3, it should be main activity 3, colon, onCreate. Once you get all of that set up, all you should do is go in there and play around and watch the log, so you can see that when you hit on next, one activity goes to the background, a new activity gets put on top, and you can hit on next a bunch of times and just keep launching activities. And then you can hit on previous all the way back, and you can see how those activities are actually set to the background and eventually destroyed when the finish is called on them. Anyway, hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions about this at all, I've just found that it's the best thing to do is to actually try this out for yourself, and it just clicks a lot more when you're actually implementing these for the first time. If you have any questions, reach out to me, leave me a comment, reach out to me directly, and until next time, coders, keep coding.